So, spoiler warning, if you have never seen BoJack Horseman and are planning on it, or if you are not caught up with the most recent half season that just dropped, like, I want you to watch this, but you should really watch that first, because I'm about to spoil a bunch of shit. Yeah, so, I mean, like, I suggest the show. It had a really big impact on me. Admittedly, kind of got a soldier through the first half of the first season, but like it's worth it after that, I promise. Whole opening titles. As I have talked about before, BoJack Horseman legitimately, I believe, contributed to saving my life. And it is a show that I quite like anyway. And it's ending. They are doing their last season, season 6. They just released the first half of the season, and the second half of the season is dropping in January. I want to say maybe January 31st, but it's kind of a big deal for me. There's kind of a lot to unpack here. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in particular was the idea of characters' happiness. Can they be happy? Can this end happily? What would a happy ending entail, especially when it comes to BoJack. I think this is a really interesting show, a show where the main character is both the hero as well as the villain. BoJack Horseman is a man, or horseman in this case, versus himself narrative. He is the one who is getting in the way of his own happiness. First of all, this idea of happiness and what the characters want, and this idea that the show seems to be just continuously reinforcing, is the idea that we have in our minds what we need to be happy. We think that, oh, if I just had this one thing, then it would all be solved. Like in the case of Princess Carolyn. Princess Carolyn wants a career and she wants a child. That has been what she has been after since the beginning of the show, and she's always had the career and she's not willing to give that up. But there's also been this idea that, well, if I just had a child, then I would be happy, then my life would be fulfilling, then I would have everything that I wanted. And this season, she now has that child, and she's not happy, and she's not being fulfilled. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, and she has to adjust in her mind what happiness looks like, what this new life is going to look like, what her relationship with her child is. We've got Diane, who thinks that, I don't know that she's even kind of after happiness. She's an interesting case. I think she's after fulfillment, and I think in a way that she thinks that her happy is being unhappy. I think that for her, this idea of like telling the tough truths and, you know, really digging in against like the big corporations and these sort of entities that she thinks are so terrible. She thinks that being a journalist in LA and struggling and facing these unhappy things are what she needs to be fulfilled. And I think that in season 6, she took a step back and said, I have a chance not to do that. And she ends up taking it. She says, I'm going to move to a different city. I'm going to work on this book, which is what she has apparently wanted and never started. So it's basically her trying out happiness. I feel like she's got the new love interest, who is a great character. You know, I really liked her with Mr. Peanut Butter, but when I saw that that wasn't gonna work, I'm happy that she has somebody else now. And so I think her idea of happiness and having it, and that it's okay to have it, is really what she discovered in this season. And then we've got Mr. Peanut Butter, who has a problem specifically with romantic relationships. He likes, when he first meets women in their relationships, they're always young and enthusiastic, and what happens is when they get into relationships with him, it starts out where they're kind of at the same level, and then what happens is, because he has such a low maturity level, the woman ends up having to be the mature one in the relationship, and he finds them to be less fun, and they become resentful, and that's what's happened with all 3 of his previous marriages, and what probably would have happened with Pickles if he had ended up marrying her. His version of happiness is making everyone else happy, and he can't make everyone else happy. That's impossible. No one can do that. And I think that he's starting to realize that sometimes he has to say the hard things that he doesn't want to say, because that's just how life works. And I think that that is the level of maturity that he wasn't willing to face before. And then that brings us to Todd. I think he is happy. I think he is genuinely happy with things the way that they are, and he doesn't seem to be generally chasing after something. Things just happen to him. Weird things just happen to him, and he's always just sort of along for the ride. His version of happiness is letting these weird things that happen to him keep happening, and it will turn out. But he has this faith in the universe because he's kind of serendipitous. I mean, he's living on people's couches, but that doesn't bother him. It'll be interesting to see what they do with him, because I don't think he needs anything to be happy. I think he already is. I think that he was put in the show to be the juxtaposition to BoJack. BoJack from the beginning has been setting out, at least he's claimed to be setting out, to be a better person, and I think what happens is he realizes what hard work that can be, and he kind of stops, and it falls apart, and he doesn't want to do it anymore. Until, you know, he wakes up the next morning and feels awful and was like, you know, I was so close, so why didn't I just stick with it? And then him going to rehab, I think it was kind of a great microcosm of that, because he was fighting against it so hard for so long, and then, you know, about halfway through the first half of the season, he realized that he didn't want to leave, even when they were trying to basically, like, push him, like, actually physically push him out the door, and he didn't want to go, because I think that he realized that he was going to have to go back to life and start doing the real work again. I think as long as he was in rehab, it wasn't really life. It was like he was responsible for these 5 things, and that he could handle. That he could handle and simultaneously be a good person. The thing is, I think that we saw him getting on the right track, especially in those last few episodes when he was going around. He was going to all of the important characters in the show and basically making amends for what he did. And I would think, well, great. That seems like it is possible, except that it now raises a new question with what he doesn't know about some of the things that are happening, which is there a point when it's too late? Everything that you've done in your past, all of the really terrible things that you've done in your past, do they eventually catch up with you and say, no, you don't get to have the happy ending because look at how terrible these things that you did are? Is that fair? Is that what he deserves? I'm going to go over what those things are in a minute here, and as I was reviewing them, I was sort of like, why am I rooting for this character? Because I just want them all to be happy, and it's like, why do I want BoJack to be happy? As a quick side note, I mentioned the other characters having a happy ending, and I don't know if their happy ending, if it would be as happy for them. It might be bittersweet. If it would be as happy for them if they all got their happy ending, but BoJack didn't. Because one of the things that I think was also being reinforced in the show is he's not asking for help. Like, they had it was like a family friends day every week at the rehab center, and he never had anyone come by. He was writing letters to Diane, but he never actually saw anyone in person. Mr. Peanut Butter showed up without BoJack asking him to, but that's not the same, and I don't think Mr. Peanut Butter was really there for BoJack. And then, you know, there's the phone conversation that BoJack has with Princess Carolyn, and she's like, why didn't you tell me? I would have been there. And then there's the one other relationship with a character who I actually have not mentioned yet, who I think is very important, and that's Hollyhock, his half-sister. Now, the way in which she ended up being in this season, I think is going to turn out to be devastating. So there are 2 things that happened in the series, one in season 2 and one in season 3. In season 3, we had what was probably the most tragic moment, with the exception of maybe some of the things that happened to Beatrice. But the most tragic thing to affect BoJack directly, which was Sarah Lynn's death, and the part that he had to play in it, which we kind of didn't talk about right after it happened. And in retrospect, it's sort of like, why did we go a couple of seasons without there kind of being any ramifications for him, because basically what happened is she died of a drug overdose, and she was with him when it happened. She was with him for the entire month before it happened. She was clean, and she, slipped up and started doing drugs and drinking and went on a complete month-long bender that resulted in her death. And BoJack was with her for much of that and instigated it, was the only one who was there when it happened, and is the only one who actually knows what happened, because he didn't tell the truth. And so all, that they know is like, she died, you found her, she had the drugs. He's made it sound like he wasn't involved in the way that he was. That's caught up with him. People are finding out about it. People are asking questions that they weren't asking before. The press is involved. Side note that's not related to anything, Paget Brewster showed up this season. The character that she's playing is what's going to be, I think, kind of BoJack's downfall, but I love her so much, and I love the character that she's playing so much. I don't know if anyone who watches BoJack Horseman is familiar with the Thrilling Adventure Hour. If you're not, I really suggest it. They're very different, but I think that, if you like one, I could see you very much liking the other. I personally love them both dearly, and the character that she plays in the Thrilling Adventure Hour, Sadie Doyle, is very similar to Paige Sinclair, the character that she's playing in BoJack Horseman, in some ways. At least the voice that she's doing is basically the same voice. And she's basically actually playing Hildy from His Girl Friday. I love it. Anyway, but that aside, she's kind of gonna ruin BoJack's life, I think, because she's getting closer to that truth. That's one of the things, is his involvement with Sarah Lynn's death. And when you really think about that, does he deserve to be happy after doing that? And this is probably BoJack's possibly biggest regret, I think. The other possibility of his biggest regret is something that happened in the season before that. And this was probably, other than maybe the lobotomy in season 4, I think this was the most disturbing thing that happened in the show. There's this woman, a deer, a literal deer, who he was in love with, Charlotte, and she moved to a different state while he was in love with her. And he didn't go with her, and he didn't go after her, and it was, he was doing his show at the time. So eventually he's like, I'm gonna go find her, and he finds her, and he finds out that she has since gotten married and has 2 kids of her own. And that's upsetting to him, but he's also got this weird thing where, he just sort of likes the people, so he starts living with them for a while, which is very weird. And he, and she's got this daughter, and she's having trouble with her boyfriend, and then her prom night rolls around. The daughter's named Penny. Penny's prom night rolls around, and she is going with a couple of friends of hers, and she doesn't have a date. And BoJack says, well, I'll go as your date. Everyone will, be jealous of you because you've got, this movie star, this TV star, as your prom date. So they go to prom, and afterwards, and it doesn't go well, and afterwards he's like, well, it's prom night, you should all be having fun, I'll get us alcohol. So these underage kids start drinking alcohol. One of Penny's friends gets horrendously ill, they need to take her to the hospital ill. And BoJack starts panicking a little bit, so he finally agrees, she does need to go to the hospital, so he takes her and her boyfriend to the hospital and drops them off and takes off and tells the boyfriend, basically threatens the boyfriend. He's like, you can't tell anyone about this, you can't tell anyone that I was involved in this, and then he takes off with Penny. Then he's alone with Penny, and he makes a move on her, basically. She makes a move on him, but he's the adult, and it is his responsibility to say, no, I'm not going to have sex with you. And he doesn't. He's not going to stop her. It would have happened if it weren't for the fact that Charlotte showed up at exactly that moment and figured out exactly what was happening. That part of it, because they're in the state of Arizona, I think? And she was 17, which apparently is the age of consent there, so that part of it wouldn't have been illegal. It just would have been really, really gross and disturbing. And I know people who stopped watching the show after that episode because they were so upset by that. That and Sarah Lynn's death are the 2 things that BoJack has done that may be, unforgivable. Or else he may need to do some sort of penance for them, and I don't even know what that would be. But basically, both of those things are being uncovered. And the thing is, Hollyhock, the one relationship in his life that I think is really properly healthy, and he was gonna maybe be a professor at her school, and he could have been around her more, and this was a relationship that he really could have built up and I think would have been good and would have been healthy, and she could have gotten the help that she needed by being around him. basically the boyfriend of the girl who gets sick is at this party that Hollyhock's at, and it's great because you don't realize it's him until pretty late in. They go outside and they're talking, and he starts to tell this like weird story, and you realize that what he's telling is what happened in season 2, and basically the half season ended with him about to tell Hollyhock who the person was that they were with, who this celebrity was. What can that possibly do to that relationship? I think the one time when a season of the show ended somewhat happily was season 4, where it ended with a phone call between the two of them. And him basically saying, I'm sorry that I wasn't the person that I should have been. And she basically says, you're not the person who you thought you were supposed to be because you were trying to be my dad, but I don't need a dad. But I could use a brother. And the idea that they could still have this relationship and that they are still family, even though they weren't family in the way that they thought that they were, was really reaffirming. And that was the moment at which it was like, oh my god, he can turn his life around and things can be great. And then season 5 happened. And then the first half of season 6 happened. Does he deserve to be happy? Has he done too much in his past to prevent him from getting that? I think especially in this sort of like cancel culture thing that we have going, if we found out that a celebrity had done the things, or was involved in the things in the way that we have found out that BoJack is, I think they would be canceled. It's interesting that because it's his story and we're kind of seeing his perspective in it, we are still rooting for him. At least, maybe some people are watching the show and not rooting for him, I don't know. And I'd be really curious to hear what other people think about this, or what other people think of the show, how you've kind of reacted to the show or interacted with the show. If nothing else, watch the episode Stupid Piece of Shit, because that was the one that helped me specifically. So, you've been watching my mental breakdown.